Good evening. Thank you for attending tonight. I'm excited to see some familiar faces from class, and I see a whole bunch of unfamiliar faces. And so it's really nice to see a lot of people here with an interest in a very important topic to me and to our presenters tonight. I'm Joe Breitenstein. I teach in the psychology department. I'm also a licensed psychologist with a small practice in town. I wanted to thank the Center for Public Ethics and Engagement and our Counseling Services Center at Luther for sponsoring this important event. I'd also like to briefly introduce you to our three speakers tonight, and we're going to let them each tell their story, and then they've graciously allowed for a question and answer period afterward, and I'll do my best to moderate that process. Maddy Ross is a junior from Orono, Minnesota, studying social work and religion. She serves as the current president of Luther's Active Minds Club and is also active as a Black Student Union ally, a member of Collegiate Choir, Luther Pride, and the Ultimate Frisbee team. She will be speaking about her struggle to find a diagnosis for irregular episodes of depression and anxiety and how she personally overcame stigma in order to become a mental health advocate. Next to Maddy is Dr. Paul Gardner. He recently retired as professor of political science at Luther College, and tonight he will discuss his experiences with obsessive-compulsive disorder and what has been helpful for him. And next to Dr. Gardner is Jayme Nelson, a graduate of Luther College, as well as an associate professor of nursing here. And she's here to share her experiences with trauma, both in her professional and personal lives, and what has aided her resilience. Stephen Hinshaw, perhaps the foremost researcher in the world in mental health stigmatization, describes common themes associated with mental illness and stigma. These include confusion, searing pain, aloneness and isolation, vulnerability, adverse effects on everyday life and experiences, but also strength and courage, shaping of identity and career, overcoming stigma, and promoting treatment. And I encourage you to listen closely for any such themes or others that might emerge in the following presentations. And we'll start with Maddy. We'll start with Paul.
Can everybody hear me? Yes. Okay. So my name is Paul Gardner, and I'm a retired professor of political science, as Joe mentioned. I'm also someone who has lived with anxiety and OCD for most of my life, even though I was not diagnosed until about a decade ago. I want to do three things in this brief talk. First, I will describe each of the parts of OCD, obsessions, compulsions, and disorder, using an example from one of my OCD themes. Second, I will give a brief account of how OCD has worked in my life. And third, I will talk about the route to my recovery. Consider these what-if thoughts. What if I don't really love my significant other? What if I push my mother under this bus? What if I didn't turn the oven off? Research demonstrates that most of us have thoughts that come out of nowhere, seem to make no sense, or are contrary to our values. We each have about 30,000 distinct thoughts a day, and so it is not surprising that some of them will be outliers, not to be taken seriously. For someone who suffers from OCD, some of these thoughts will become sticky or stuck. OCD sufferer David Adams says OCD, quote, holds my thoughts captive, end quote. The three what-if questions I asked became stuck for me at different points in my life. In OCD lingo, I suffered from relationship OCD in my 20s, harm OCD in my 40s, and responsibility OCD in my 50s. Each became an obsession with significant consequences for my life and how I thought about myself. None torment me today, not because I don't have these kinds of intrusive thoughts, but because I've learned to manage them and the anxiety that inevitably accompanies them. The O in OCD. The American Psychiatric Association defines obsessions as recurrent and persistent thoughts, urges, or images that are experienced as intrusive and unwanted, end quote. I have the thought, what if I left the burner on? Many OCD sufferers have the distorted cognitive idea that every thought, especially thoughts that touch upon sensitive areas, are important, almost like the thought is really an action. Having the thought that I left the burner on feels like I left the burner on. It feels this way because it becomes stuck and it is connected to the feeling of anxiety. The feeling of anxiety then becomes the signal that something is wrong and gives an emotional charge to what is really an irrational thought, a thought that most of you let pass easily through your minds. Once it gets that emotional charge, it feels too dangerous to let go. Obsessions cause OCD sufferers distress, meaning anxiety, and so we naturally try to relieve our anxiety. We do this through compulsions, the C in OCD. The American Psychiatric Association defines compulsions as, quote, repetitive behaviors or mental acts that are carried out in response to obsessions, end quote. Up until a few years ago, I would routinely have the thought as I left the house that I left the oven on. Or when I pulled my car into the garage, I would think that I drove over someone. In both cases, I would check and recheck over and over again until my anxiety went down enough to move on with my day. I remember one day, in particular, I was leaving on a trip out of town, and on my last pass through the house, I stopped in front of the stove. I stared at the knobs, trying to memorize their positions as a way to convince myself they were off, so I could get in the car and leave. About 10 miles south of Decorah, another what if thought popped into my head. What if the knobs were off, but I brushed by one and accidentally turned it on? With that thought, a whoosh of anxiety, and back I went to check. The problem with compulsions, whether physical or mental, is they train our brain to fear the very thing our obsessions torment us with. Compulsions or avoiding what we fear does reduce anxiety in the short term, but sets us up for more anxiety in the future. There is a never-ending list of what-ifs our brains can manufacture to keep us safe. It is the high level of anxiety and distress that is the basis for the D, or the disorder part of OCD. Psychiatrist Ian Osborne puts it this way, quote, obsessive-compulsive disorder occurs in degrees of severity, mild, moderate, and severe. In mild cases, an individual is troubled by obsessions and compulsions, yet gets along satisfactorily in all aspects of life. In moderate cases, the symptoms are not only disturbing, but disrupting. They interfere significantly with a person's ability to function normally in work, family, or social life. In severe cases, the ability to function normally may be lost, end quote. Most of my adult life, up to about a decade ago, my OCD fluctuated between mild and moderate. In my 40s, I entered therapy for what I now know were OCD symptoms. OCD was not well understood in the mid-1980s, with the most effective therapies still a decade or more away. My well-meaning therapist focused on how my harm-related obsessive thoughts reflected unconscious conflicts and urges. For an OCD sufferer, this approach was like pouring gasoline on a fire. It encouraged us to take our thoughts even more seriously, with the end result, even more anxiety and more compulsions. The modern therapeutic approach to OCD obsessions is that they are fleeting, irrational thoughts that have no basis at all in genuine desire. In fact, what I have since learned is that OCD attacks where we are most vulnerable. This makes sense. The what-if questions we are most sensitive to are the ones connected to the images we have of ourselves. Now to the good news about OCD, and it is really good news. In a little over 3 decades, OCD has gone from one of the most difficult psychological disorders to treat to one where there is a gold standard of treatment that results in improved lives, significantly improved lives, for roughly 70% of those who follow the protocols. I am living proof of this. There are 2 basic parts to the treatment I followed, a cognitive part and a behavioral part. The cognitive part involved reframing many of the mistaken ideas about thoughts I had grown up with. 3 examples of reframing that were particularly powerful to me were that thoughts are really not under our control, thoughts do not indicate our character, and thoughts are really not a good path toward understanding our inner selves. In other words, I learned to have a different relationship to my thoughts. If you inserted the word feelings for thoughts, I would add that I also learned to have a different relationship to my feelings, especially the feeling of anxiety. By far the most difficult treatment component, but also the most effective for OCD, is the behavioral piece. The gold standard behavioral treatment goes by the acronym ERP, meaning exposure, response, prevention. The exposure part of ERP involves confronting one's obsessions and the situations that trigger them. The response prevention part means not engaging in one's usual responses, like using compulsions, and instead accepting one's thoughts and feelings. When I do ERP, I expose myself in various ways to the things I fear, and eventually my brain learns that I do not fear these things, and it stops sending me fear signals or anxiety. Or if it continues to send me anxiety, I have learned to tolerate it. For example, one exposure assignment was to not check my stove when I left my house. I failed over and over and over again on this particular exposure until one day I just said, I'm going to leave the house and tolerate the anxiety that I will feel and accept the possibility that I did leave the stove on. From that point on, exposure began to work for me. I now do exposure to all kinds of things I fear, knowing the anxiety that will accompany these exposures will not harm me, and more importantly, is not really a danger signal, but just noise. This took a few years. Today, my OCD is still a constant presence, but it's like a relative that overstayed her welcome, and so I built a little cottage out back where she lives. I see her every day, but her presence doesn't really bother me. Some days I even invite her in just to remind me I can send her back out when she gets too tiresome. One of my favorite OCD specialists, Stephen Phillipson, says we are all stuck in the mud hole, meaning we all have emotional and psychological challenges. OCD has been one of mine. I look out at the audience, knowing each of you have your own. Whatever your challenge, don't let it define you. Don't feel alone. There is help available for most psychological disorders. For those interested in knowing more about OCD, I'm happy to share more about my story and what I have learned from a good deal of reading and reflection. Please go ahead and email me. I'm no longer on campus because I'm retired. My email address is gardnerp@luther.edu. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jayme Nelson, and I'm teaching in the nursing department here. And I wanted to start by saying that the real reason I'm here, which is way outside my comfort zone, I have to say, is really in deep gratitude for many students who over the years have shared just an inordinate amount of courage. To say that I'm in absolute awe of the resiliency of some students is really an understatement. And it really is an honor of them and the courage that they have had in sharing things with me that I agreed to speak tonight about mental health issues. I've lived most of my life on the other side of things, either as a nurse practitioner counseling people about anxiety or depression, or as a teacher who calmly teaches about the science behind depression or anxiety. And so it's one thing to be firmly in control and intellectually examining something, and another thing to share a little bit. So tonight I'd like to just share briefly about 3 mental health concerns that have directly impacted my health and my life, with an end goal really of conveying hope. Most of my working life was spent in critical care nursing, a career that I started right after college. I was a complete overachiever and an adrenaline junkie in every respect, and eventually found my way into providing care for trauma patients, for those who were severely burned, and for victims of homicide and suicide. I was at the top of my game professionally and quite skilled in really complex surgical procedures. I worked hard to be that nurse that could handle anything that walked through the door, and I was. But what I wasn't equipped for, was woefully unequipped for, was the absolute devastation of the things that I saw. No one could have possibly prepared me for being 24 years old and working with someone who had been brutally raped, buried alive, multiply stabbed. Nobody could have prepared me for taking care of a shaken baby who died on Christmas Eve and driving home while What Child Is This played on the radio. I was completely unprepared for that piece of what my professional life was. And, you know, I honestly didn't understand what was happening really to me in the midst of all of the trauma cases that I took care of. Until I took care of a patient who was not much older than many of you, who had a catastrophic surgical complication, who came into the operating room hemorrhaging to death. I was the nurse that was in charge of the operating room that night. We thought she was unconscious because she had no blood pressure really, but she was conscious, and she was absolutely terrified. And I was with her as she went to sleep, and I mean really with her, really 100%. I leaned down, I put my cheek against hers, I held her hand, and I told her she would be okay. You can probably guess that it was so traumatic for me because she wasn't okay and ended up dying on the table. And I didn't understand what was happening to me, honestly. I didn't understand why I couldn't stop thinking about her, why I couldn't eat, why I couldn't sleep. At that point, you know, I think support was more minimal, I guess, for healthcare providers. You know, we were supportive of one another, but I tried calling the employee assistance program. You know, the first question was I overtly suicidal? I wasn't, so then I was 4 months out for an appointment. It wasn't until I collapsed publicly, rather dramatically outside the lunchroom line in the middle of lunch, and had a stat page to the hospital chaplain for the nurse. Usually they page them for the patients. That I was able to see and was told that really what I had was pretty significant PTSD. And it was really at that beginning that I started to get better, honestly. A little bit at a time. 5 years, every time I thought of her, I would cry. 10 years, I tried one time talking about her in class and I cried and it was okay. And I think part of the recovery from that is being able to talk about it. Because once I started being able to talk about her, I have peace. I have peace. I think about her all the time. I think about many of the patients I took care of that passed away. And I can see them like it was yesterday, and some of them were 25 years ago, and I feel peace. And that, I hope to give you hope, because it was very traumatic, and it took a long time. But you can find peace. The second thing I wanted to touch on is just, you know, what it's like to live with crippling anxiety at times. Anxiety is really prevalent. It's really one of the #1 things that people actually land in primary care for. They don't necessarily know that it's anxiety driving their condition, but it is. And anxiety, when it's really bad, can absolutely cripple your life. And I have, usually it's for me very cumulative. If I'm really busy at work and I'm really stressed at work, I lose my resilience a little bit. And then something like hearing that we've lost 60% of the animal population since 1970, and I'm gone. I'm a wreck, and I can't stop thinking about it and worrying about it, and I find myself sometimes incapable of picking toothpaste out at Walmart where there's 3,000, my gosh, there's whitening, fluoride, Aquafresh, Flip Top. And, my very loving husband, who's an amazing supportive, can go, honey, just pick one. And I can say, I can't, because all the animals are dying in the world. And so that one is harder to find peace, I'd say. I volunteer at the Humane Society. I have rescued an inordinate amount of animals to the point where it's a little on the border of crazy. I donate to causes. I try to give as much away to charity. I try to have hope, even though those kinds of things make me feel hopeless and anxious. So that one, I still work on. And the last thing that I would mention, and actually the trigger for, I think, why I was asked on this panel, was in visiting with their director of counseling. We were talking about suicide. And I had dealt with quite a few patients who had attempted suicide or completed suicide and came to me for an organ procurement, but had never personally been touched until almost 2 years ago when my stepfather committed suicide. And I think the experience of having someone in your family commit suicide is really almost indescribable. And I've been humbled by thinking that I understood this from working with people, from maybe having students, and what it feels like to live with it. I would say probably personally one of the more devastating experiences I've had. And just a very, if you've ever, I was the person that had to deal with all the details. And I am 53 years old, and I felt like I was 12. I didn't know. I thought people came and cleaned up the scene. I didn't know that was me. I thought I wouldn't have to decide about organ donation. I had guns to deal with. I had papers, an amazing array when someone dies of papers. And so that it's been 2 years, and I feel okay. It's taken a lot of hard work and counseling and supportive people. But I guess I want to convey that no matter what happens to us, and I know many in this room must have personal struggles. Who doesn't really have personal struggles? That there is absolute hope. That, I feel like I'm a fairly high-functioning person. I'm gainfully employed. I have a loving family. I've made it through the other side. And I just wish that, and wish for you to have peace and support in whatever journey that you're in yourselves. Thank you.
Okay, is this working? Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, my name's Maddie. On behalf of Active Minds, I want to thank you for the chance to share my story with you tonight. I became interested in Active Minds' mission after I myself had a mental health crisis that unraveled everything I thought I knew about shame and stigma. I chose to tell my story because for the longest time, I didn't believe that it was valid, that my experiences were not as real or as dire as the struggles that others had. Throughout my struggles with mental health, I never found a home within a specific diagnosis. I've been squeezed between classifications and treatments, pills and practices, and I know now that even though it required patience and grit, the process of finding my way to manage my mental health was worth the time and effort. I want to share my story in hopes that someone listening can find validation that whatever they're experiencing is real and it matters. So here we go. Fitting with the title for tonight, here's my story of struggle, depression, self-doubt, irrationality, disaster, triumph, healing, and purpose. In my life, I've experienced 3 depressive episodes and 1 manic episode. For the sake of time, I want to share just the most recent chapter of my story. Right before my freshman year of college, I was at my peak in terms of holistic wellness. I started a health plan and lost a lot of weight. I got 5th place nationally for a market research project I did, and I went on a life-changing backpacking trip with my best friends from my church. When starting at Luther, I had high self-confidence and I felt completely capable of starting college. The success I found my senior year of high school carried into fall semester. But once fall semester ended, suddenly everything halted to a stop. There was no situational reason why I was feeling depressed, but returning to campus for J-term, I just knew something felt wrong. More wrong than I had ever experienced before. It was like I had tunnel vision. In just a few weeks, I had gone from feeling on top of the world to not being able to see 10 feet in front of me, to being buried alive by shame and sadness. Nothing bad had happened to me, so what was going on? Words still failed to articulate exactly what it was that hit me and how I felt. I was never homesick, just sick of where I was. I didn't want to go home. I didn't want to be at Luther. I didn't want to go anywhere. Defeated, I thought I couldn't find any place in the world away from the sting of these emotional and irrational thoughts. I cried all the time. Every night I would uncontrollably cry. Sometimes out of excruciating dread, other times out of terror at what my anxiety was telling me. This state took its toll on every aspect of my life. My education, work, relationships, emotions, everything was up to question. I remember feeling like I was constantly on display. I would hyperanalyze all of my social interactions, whether that was with my close friends, my professors, or even talking to workers in the caf. I would sleep 3 hours every night, sitting up, worrying about things like who I needed to face the next day and what I needed to know for class. Between all these odd ruminations and worries, I'd just be screaming inside over and over again, enough, just be normal, just relax. And I'd wake up the next day, change my clothes 4 or 5 times before leaving for class, then usually go back to my room at some point later in the day to change again, 1 or 2 more times. My clothes were something that I could control, and I obsessed over harnessing any ounce of that control that I could get. But my most confusing and scary symptom, and one that I had never experienced before this episode, was when I stopped talking. Anyone who knows me or has witnessed my friends and I in Oneota would describe me as chatty. As a highly extroverted person, I gained my energy from being silly with my friends and from trying to woo strangers into being unapologetic and outspokenly a weirdo. But when my struggles came, it was like that light inside me burnt out. I not only was too tired to speak at all to anyone, I was literally terrified. I couldn't fathom the idea of someone perceiving me as weird or, God forbid, depressed or anxious. My sudden and drastic stage of silence was scary for me and my friends, and they truly did what they could. They didn't question my silence at our long nightly dinners. They were confused, but they were also present and patient. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was a burden to my loved ones, and I thought I would remain a burden unless I could fix what was happening to me, to fix myself. And I went into this fix-it mindset with a very specific idea of ways that I did not want to get help. More than anything, I did not want to start medication at all. Stigma about pills and needing unnatural means of treatment made it all seem too serious and too real. I convinced myself that medication would turn me into someone else. I convinced myself that by seeking medication, I was letting depression and anxiety win. But in all reality, not sleeping, not talking, not having an appetite with no why hurt so much more than any stigma ever could. I surrendered to seeking out diagnosis and medication, and it wasn't until much later that I was truly able to overcome these problematic stigmas. I started taking a combination of 2 medications to alleviate my symptoms, and after 5 months on them, I didn't feel any different. I wondered what was wrong with me, why nothing was making me feel better, and soon I turned to substance abuse to escape my problems that my medications weren't solving. In May of that year, self-medicating by not regularly taking my antidepressants, and when I did, mixing them with substances consistently, was the next phase of my journey. Mixing substances with my antidepressants every day was not simply a series of bad decisions. The biological complexities happening under the surface made me feel like the only way I could be happy was by using them to alleviate my pain, even if just for a little while. After a few weeks of mixing substances with my medication every day, this unhealthy mix sent happiness over the edge. This was when I went into a manic episode for 3 weeks. I went from never speaking at all just a few weeks before to doing nothing but talking. Not conversing, but talking. I wouldn't stop for a second to take a breath. I wouldn't wait for people's responses, and I would stay up for hours at night writing down ideas. That's when those around me realized my mental health troubles were coming back in a different costume this time. I went from irrationally second-guessing myself to a state of amped-up confidence and nonstop hyperactivity, which I didn't see as an issue at the time. I was finally not only happy, but super happy. So why were my friends and family so concerned? Soon this episode brought me to the point of no longer being able to perform my summer job. I'm still healing from being asked to leave my job and to get treatment. I still struggle with forgiving myself for my personal responsibility and decisions that put my fragile mental health in jeopardy. But the fact of the matter is, getting tripped up on blaming myself for having these different symptoms got me nowhere. And abusing substances was a symptom. After this second drastic and sudden mental health crisis in just 6 months, I didn't even want to think about revisiting medication options, seeing as they seemed to only hurt more than help the first time. My mental health professional helped me to realize that they were just the wrong pills for me, but that finding the right ones could help me greatly in managing my health. I was able to drop my reservations about medication when my counselor described it as a life preserver, when it felt like my symptoms were drowning me. We would never view someone wearing a life jacket in an aggressive ocean tide as weak. They just need help to stay on the surface. So why did I think using medication as a way to stay on my surface made me weak? We would never expect someone with a broken leg to walk on it without a cast. So why did I struggle to view someone on psychiatric medication in that same empathetic lens? And that was when I truly began to understand stigma. My healing finally came out of sheer exhaustion from the guilt that I was carrying around. I was so tired of blaming myself for my manic episode, of being embarrassed by it. I was finally able to trade my shame for peace when my counselor showed me how I was contributing to stigma when I would convince myself that it was all my fault. After all I had endured, I wanted to find a home in my own heart again, to truly forgive myself. Now when my guilt creeps back in, I trust the understanding that mania from abusing substances was part of my journey that taught me to truly value and prioritize my well-being. My life now is informed by my freshman year experiences with mental health, but not in negative ways. I finally found better medication, which I've been taking consistently for 2 years. My medication helps me to be my best self, to make my ups less high and my downs less low. I continue to meet with my counselor, who helps me foster a new dialogue within myself as one of tenderness and understanding, especially when I struggle with relationships because of my mental health. I am my own advocate now that I am able to establish boundaries and expectations from my support network and let go of those who misunderstand me because of my mental health journey. I prioritize my self-care schedule, which I used to see as a daunting task as an overbooked Gen Z individual. But now I know that my self-care language may simply mean taking 10 extra minutes in the morning when I take a shower and using sensory imagery to picture my anxiety or sadness from the day being washed away down the drain. Other days, it might mean just taking 10 extra minutes to journal, or more likely, start a historical documentary before my Frisbee practice in the afternoon. My life is more fruitful than before my mental health struggles because it taught me to prioritize joy, gratitude, and laughter in my everyday life. In closing, I'd like to offer 4 challenges about how we can create change. 1, challenge your community, Luther. 2, challenge your biases. 3, challenge your fears. And 4, challenge your discomfort. First, I hope that as a community, we can commit ourselves to courageous, empathetic, and radical willingness to talk about mental health. We must talk about this. We lose so much when we don't give ourselves the freedom and acceptance to share our whole selves here. And we could gain so much if we are willing to cross that barrier. Second, I hope that we can challenge our individual biases. We must recognize the ways in which we ourselves stigmatize mental health and correct those inner narratives that tell us to trivialize it. If you yourself struggle with mental health, pay attention to your instinct to stigmatize yourself and use the resources around you to find your own language of self-care and self-love. Third, challenge your fears. Fear will always lurk around sharing your authentic story. If we greet our fear of vulnerability with gentleness and connection, we have the power to be our best selves, struggle and all. Share your story. Lastly, challenge your discomfort. Ask your friend with a mental illness how you can better support them. Or look in the mirror and ask how you can better support yourself. Call on your inquiry and discuss mental health with your professors. Ask your family, your parents, about your family's history. It is truly all around us. 1/4 of the world's population will struggle with mental health at some point in their lives. Break down your walls of discomfort and trust that those who matter won't judge, and those who judge are simply not educated. After tonight, I hope we will all be both the ones who don't judge and the ones who will help educate others. Thank you.
My guess is that you've had an experience similar to mine where you tried to explain to someone else what is special about Luther. And one of my favorite words is ineffable, and it's a great word and ironically means something that you can't put into words. And that's what it feels like when you're trying to explain what's special about Luther. You're trying to explain this to someone somewhere else, they say, yeah, but it's a college. Like, no, there's something more about that. This is ineffable. This is what Luther is about. This is deep sharing and encouraging you to grow, both academically and personally. And so I would encourage you, if not tonight with the resources outside of the hall, then next week or next year, whenever you're ready to take those steps, to get any help that you might need, and to join our speakers in those really profound places of peace and safety. So let's thank our speakers again, please.
Thank you.
They've also been gracious enough, gracious as well in offering the opportunity for some questions and answers. So please, anyone who would like to ask any of the speakers or myself a question, please, this is the time to share. Thank you. Nice and loud, please.
I have a question. I'm so sorry, I forgot your name. The nursing professor.
Jayme, yeah.
So obviously you're out of your industry now. You're educating future nurses. Are there programs or courses in place to sort of prepare nurses in that field for what you've experienced?
That is a great question. You know, we try to embed it. I think our understandings of sort of workplace trauma are growing. I mean, there's a lot of research that has come out recently about the experience of emergency room nurses and abuse. I mean, so there's now we worry about guns and about shootings in hospitals. And so we're starting to see much more emphasis, I think, in supporting professionals. You know, honestly, we need to probably do more. We try to embed it throughout sort of our curriculum, but it's kind of hard to know where to exactly put it as well. So we tend to, when we see it come forth, it's usually like when we're talking with students in our clinical experiences about things that they maybe see or feel or are experiencing. But that's a great question. We need more of that, I'm certain.
It's a great question, and I think one of the kind of truths about life is if you're a contractor and a carpenter, your house is the last one to get repaired. There's an old saying that the cobbler's kids go without shoes, and helpers are liable in wanting to help everybody else first. And I think there is, I agree with Jayme, a growing but still very necessary recognition of helpers needing to take care of themselves, and that becoming a more active part of our curriculum. In An Unquiet Mind by Kay Redfield Jemison is one of the best books about disclosing about mental illness. She's in medical school at UCLA and finally admits that she needs to get help for her serious bipolar disorder, and she goes to the medical director at UCLA. It's a pretty big program. And she says, I have this disorder, and I'm really worried you're going to take away my hospital privileges. And she said that the medical director just looked at her and said, if I took away the medical privileges of everybody who is struggling with psychological issues, we'd have to close the doors.
And I was just going to add, Lauren, there's a great book that was released in the last couple of years called Trauma Stewardship, and it addresses what you're talking about, this idea of secondary trauma, which is that these people who are helping professionals are traumatized from their work with trauma. So it's, yeah, I'll get you that title. It's cool.
Go ahead, please. Well, first, I would like to thank our speakers tonight. And I understand that there's this shared thing with mental health, the confusion. There's like this almost the first stage everybody deals with. And maybe this question for Dr. Gardner, since it took you a while until you started realizing what you were having. It's like, my question is, because when I experienced confusion, for instance, and I might bring this example from a couple of days ago, I heard big news, and it was like definitely influenced me, but I didn't do anything about it, or I did not react. And I almost forgot about it until 2 days after, and then I remembered all of a sudden, I was like, wow, it was big, but how did I put it in the back of my mind that I did not deal with it at all? Wherein, like, if I heard it at that moment, I would have an immediate reaction. I would be thinking about it right away. When do you know you're confused, or like, if that thought has gone to the back of your head, when do you know that it's something you have to deal with? I don't know if that's something you experience, but how do you overcome the confusion?
So the question involves, how do you overcome the confusion about, the thing about OCD, and I think it's probably true of other psychological disorders, you're oftentimes ashamed of what you're thinking, what you're experiencing. You are confused, and in my case, I didn't tell anybody. I kept it inside. And I just lived my life the best I could. So I think, and of course, this is a different time now. When I was your age, people didn't talk about this. And when I was twice your age, people didn't talk about this much. And I think it's, so I guess that's the best answer I can give you for that. I mean, I think just talking with others about one's confusion or one's shame or one's experiences is probably a pretty good antidote. And so, yeah.
Maddie, you guys all talked about talking about mental illness and just like the urgency to start talking about it now. And just like you just said, like sharing your story, understanding your confusion. I'm just wondering what talking about mental illness looks like for someone who's not experiencing it themselves. Like a lot of people know it's something that you can't see from the outside a lot of the time. People might not want to share their stories. Like, what does the conversation look like for people without mental illness or people with mental illness? Like, what does that look like?
I mean, you're at a great place to explore that question, you know? Like, it's kind of like what I said towards the end. Like, it can be in the classroom, it can be with a friend on the phone, it can be in front of a lecture hall. And you can start with taking mental health first aid as a course. Like, things like that are a good starting point. But I'd say, take caution when you bring it up with someone who experiences mental health that you know of. And I guess that's all I really have to say about that.
I would say the conversations, I think, often don't start there, I guess, but often start because someone really wants to share something, and sometimes I think when I started, really the debt to students. I mean, I'm often chagrined that I've sometimes been advising a student or working with a student for three and a half years before they mention that a dear friend in high school committed suicide, or maybe a parent died, or just some really difficult thing. So I think a lot of empathetic listening and kindness and just curiosity of how you can help is often where I think it starts.
Yeah, I would say I would second your point about how not leading with a particular psychological challenge, not leading with that, but instead talk. It's nice to have conversations about the common challenges we all have to living, especially in the kind of world we live in today, with our all constant status seeking, the networking. There's so many processes, life processes, that can go awry a little bit, and that's a nice inroad into, how do you handle certain things? And then maybe eventually you'll get into, or the other person will feel comfortable talking about their own challenges. So I think those are really important conversations to have.
This is from Maddy. I was curious, when you were freshmen and you're separated from your parents, and was it more complicated to bring them into this, or, did you how did you handle that?
A lot of sobbing over FaceTime and a lot of scaring them. And my dad's here and he can attest to that. It was really difficult. I'd say, it didn't help that it was January and it got dark at 4 in the afternoon with seasonal effectiveness and all that. It was very difficult. And like I said, I was homesick, but I didn't want to be home, so it was confusing. But luckily I have a very, very strong and supportive community at home that approached it without judgment and that accepted me as I was and not as I should be. And my parents definitely fostered that idea in our home as well, and with this, because it was complicated and it was completely out of nowhere. So, yeah, thank you. Does that answer your question? Okay.
You guys all mentioned that you'd made it through your struggles and
why and what exactly makes you thankful you made it through and everything?
I think making it through is a journey. I mean, I have still lots of work of, maybe continuing positive coping skills and maybe not eating or other negative coping skills. But I think, through it all, I think, especially with my dad's suicide, I guess you realize, I think, that you are part of a community, you're part of a family. People count on you and love you. You count on people and love them. And I think, when you kind of dig yourself out of the hole that you might sort of feel that you're in, you're able to see goodness and beauty and hope.
I'm sorry, can you just repeat the question one more time?
I just kind of wanted you guys to talk about how you felt it was worth it to get through the battle and everything. Your journey there.
Yeah, no, thanks. I think it's just, for me, it's vocationally. I would never have the passion for mental health advocacy that I do if I didn't go through that, like I said, the tunnel vision, the darkness by myself. Or not by myself, but if I didn't go through it myself. So I guess just this idea that I will be a better mental health professional someday because of it, and that I will be able to empathize and truly be at an equal with the client as someone who's kind of, I guess you could say, come out the other side. So I guess that's my why.
Yeah, I would say it makes you more aware of the preciousness of life, and it makes you more aware of your own thoughts, and it makes you more empathetic with others, knowing that others are struggling with other challenges. If I had the choice to relive my life without OCD, I don't think I would take that choice. OCD has become a friend. And by that I mean has taught me things. Or the recovery protocol has actually taught me things, but I wouldn't have gone through that recovery protocol without the disorder in the first place. It's truly a friend.
I guess I was just gonna ask Jayme how, after your meltdown and realizing you had PTSD, how did you go forward in your career and able to treat or moderate it while still being exposed to trauma?
Yeah, that was, so actually, the talk I had sitting on the floor outside the cafeteria with the chaplain was the beginning. And then counseling really helped. And then the pastor actually encouraged us, which is now kind of commonplace whenever there's something really tough that happens, that after tough cases, we would all of us involved in the case would talk. And so physicians, anesthesiologists, nursing staff, we would carve out some time in the nursing lounge and we would talk through it. And that's really instrumental, and I think studies actually support that that's one way for workplace trauma. The support, because everyone else is there, they all are kind of traumatized often too, and so that can be wonderfully supportive. And we started doing that more and more and more, and that really did help.
What has been the hardest part of each of your journeys?
I think, honestly, the stigma's real. I mean, I had to laugh that I had volunteered to give a talk about stigma and then had a mini meltdown that it was in the paper. Isn't that funny? Because I'm like, oh my gosh, all my family's gonna see. And sorry, I didn't mean to. But I think working through that is still hard. I mean, students, knowing a little bit about, you in ways that is probably the hardest for me. It's getting easier, but I like to have it all together. It's hard to be someone who admits that they've had some struggles.
For me, it's the shame. It's something that doesn't really go away. You just get better at recognizing when it's there. And I think that the shame that was present throughout the journey was the most difficult to grapple with when people had tried to ask me to explain what it was that was going on, or put a name to it, and I couldn't. Not only because I wasn't given a straightforward diagnosis, which I still don't have, but because even writing this, it took so long just to try and write out what exactly it was I was thinking and experiencing. So for me, it was just trying to explain the unexplainable.
ERP is really hard because it involves not doing compulsions that were done to lessen anxiety. So you have to learn to tolerate your anxiety. Eventually, your mind will habituate to it, but sometimes that's not the case, and so that's been by far the hardest thing for me. And now as I sit in front of you, I don't know how it looks to you. Maybe it looks to you like it really wasn't very hard because of the way I'm talking about it. OCD is my friend. But it was really hard. And I'll just say one thing about stigma. I was never confronted with the stigma because I never told anybody. But a phrase you used, I stigmatized myself. So in that sense, the stigma was turned inside. And just learning about the disorder freed me up, in my case, my disorder freed me up a little bit from this, because I realized that what I felt ashamed about were just common, ordinary thoughts that everyone has that I took literally.
One more question, please.
Real quick, and this might be a good wrap-up. How, you each kind of just touched on this a little bit, but I'd like to hear a little more about what your experience was preparing to share your story today, and how you're feeling about it now in this moment, now that you've done it.
I've actually been sharing this story for a year or two, and it's just phenomenal. It's fantastic because, if only one person in the audience says, okay, this sounds maybe a little bit like me, and now I know there's help out there, and I see a road out, makes it all worthwhile, for me anyway.
I was really nervous. I mean, like, I physically, I'm not going to be okay. I'm sorry about all the feedback too. But I was, and so it was a little hard to prepare, and I didn't know quite what to share, how to share it. But I will tell you, every single time I talk about things that were really hard, and I'm okay, it's like wow. I can see this patient, I can talk about this patient, and I'm not just like a puddle. If that feels so empowering, and so and the fact that I hope I can give back again. So many students have given, to me, and so I'm grateful for the opportunity to try to offer support and hope, I guess.
In preparing, I had to cut out a lot, evidently. I really was on board with the idea, but then of course there were the times where I was freaked out, Stigma telling me there was parts of my story I shouldn't talk about, specifically Mania I thought I really shouldn't be talking about. But of course then I was thinking, wait, then I should share about it more because it's something that Stigma's telling me not to talk about. So in preparing, that was something that I really grappled with, was this idea of what I should and shouldn't share. But now I just feel so empowered because I know that it's not just my story that I'm carrying right now. It's my friends that are in this room and that aren't in this room that I know struggle with mental illness or struggle with symptoms of their own or are feeling lost in their journey or feeling found. That really empowers me and makes me proud to be part of Active Minds. And if you don't know what I'm talking about when I say Active Minds, just like go to the table after, because they'll be out there, so yeah.
Mental illness and stigma divide us. Millions suffer silently and in ways that are compounded greatly by the insensitivity of others, adding to the confusion, searing pain, aloneness and isolation, and vulnerability that can permeate our everyday lives and experiences. That much is abundantly clear. It also appears clear from our speakers tonight that mental illness and stigma can be transformative experiences, generating intrinsic strength and courage, shaping identity and career, and battling stigma by promoting treatment. We are a tribal species, Republicans versus Democrats, Packers versus Vikings, the mentally healthy versus the mentally ill. Unfortunately, society currently manipulates and capitalizes upon these tribal differences and ignores shared aspects of our existence. But ultimately, we all want representative government. We all want to win the Super Bowl. The stigmatizing tribalization or tribalism between those with mental health and mental illness is also a false dichotomy. Every human being has either experienced a significant mental illness or is or has been in close contact with someone they care about that has a mental illness. All of us are affected by mental illness on a larger scale. As one of my profs used to say, show me a headline and I'll show you a diagnosis. It's funny how when we might be struggling with a difficult time, emotionally or physically, and we say we just want life to feel normal again. We promise ourselves that we will better appreciate normal when we regain it, but too often we get consumed with more superficial concerns that make us forget how special everyday life can be. I've come to believe that mental illness, especially trauma, isn't what divides us as much as it is what unites us. The shared experiences of all difficulties, to whatever degree, clinical or subclinical, may be the ultimate unifying factor. The strength and courage, the shaping of identity and battling stigma while promoting treatment exemplifies qualities we all need at some point in our lives as we face the inevitable confusion, searing pain, aloneness and isolation, and vulnerability that it takes to be fully human. Our three speakers tonight all demonstrated those attributes and regained possession and appreciation of their everyday lives. The disorders that at one point mattered most in their lives led them to the normal everyday lives that ultimately really matter the most. Please join me in thanking them for sharing that strength with us tonight. Please join me in thanking them for teaching us that abnormal is really normal and for reminding us of the only true normal that really matters.